There was a time when the Earth was a vast, unknown, and hostile world. There were no cities, organized languages, or civilizations. There were no books, no temples, no roads. Only wind, ice, lava, wild animals, and nights so dark they seemed eternal. It was in that primitive world, shaped by volcanic eruptions, climactic cataclysms, and unpredictable geological changes, where Neanderthals first emerged. And what we know of them today is merely an echo buried in the earth, an echo that, nevertheless, resonates strongly in our own bones. Before we dive into this ancestral story, I invite you to reflect. Who were the Neanderthals really? Were they primitive beasts, as they were portrayed for so long? Or were they complex, sensitive, adaptive humans who lived, suffered, loved, and fought like us? Stay until the end of this video and discover what modern science has revealed about our closest relatives. And before we continue, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment on what you think about the possibility that we still carry something of the Neanderthals in our blood. Approximately 400,000 years ago, somewhere between Europe and Western Asia, the first groups of Neanderthals began to differentiate themselves from other hominids. Their evolution was a slow process, molded by the extreme cold of the ice ages, the scarcity of food, and the need to survive in a world that offered no truce. They were not the only humans on the planet. They coexisted at different times with other species like Homo erectus, Denisovans, and even much later with Homo sapiens. But their presence marked a distinct era, the era of resistance. Neanderthals were physically different from us, more robust, with elongated skulls, low foreheads, wide noses, and short limbs. Their build was not coincidental. Every feature was a meticulous adaptation to the cold environment of the Pleistocene. Their nose, for example, allowed them to warm the air before it reached their lungs. Their muscle mass not only gave them strength, but also thermal resistance. And although their physical appearance was interpreted for centuries as proof of inferiority or brutality, today we know that this is nothing more than an erroneous prejudice. Contrary to the old view of savage troglodytes, Neanderthals were capable of great feats. They made sophisticated tools from stones that they carved with precision, used spears, and knew how to butcher large animals like mammoths or woolly rhinoceroses. Their diet was varied, including meat, fruits, roots, and in some cases even seafood, which indicates a degree of adaptation and extraordinary environmental knowledge. But what has surprised archaeologists and anthropologists the most is not just their technical ability, but their inner world. There is evidence that Neanderthals cared for their sick, even when they could no longer fend for themselves. Skeletons with serious injuries that healed over time have been found, which could only have happened if someone else fed and protected them for long periods. There are also indications that they buried their dead, which suggests a rudimentary but real conception of death, mourning, and perhaps transcendence. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence of Neanderthal symbolic thought are the remains found in the Bruniquel cave in France. There, more than 170,000 years ago, a group of Neanderthals carefully placed hundreds of stalagmite fragments forming circular structures. No one knows for sure what they were for: rituals, shelters, territorial markers. The only clear thing is that this action was not accidental. It required planning, cooperation, and an intention beyond simple survival. For a long time, the image of the Neanderthal was distorted by the arrogance of modern man. The first remains were discovered in the 19th century in the Neander Valley in Germany, and since then they have been associated with the rudimentary, the gross, the subhuman. However, each new paleontological finding has dismantled this view. Today, thanks to advances in genetics, we know that Neanderthals not only coexisted with Homo sapiens, but also interbred with them. As a consequence, many of us carry between 1 and 4% of Neanderthal DNA. This changes everything. They are no longer the other, an extinct species with no connection to us. They are part of our history, of our biological identity. They remind us that human evolution was not linear, clean, or exclusive. It was a complex web of adaptations, mixtures, conflicts, and learning. The life of a Neanderthal was a constant struggle against the environment. Nature offered no comforts. The caves were cold and dark. The animals were giant and lethal. Diseases were deadly, and every day was a new threat. However, they managed to survive for more than 300,000 years, much longer than we, Homo sapiens, have existed. This fact alone should make us rethink everything we believe about intelligence, success, and evolution. But what else do we know about their daily life? How did they organize themselves? How did they raise their children? What emotions did they experience? And what was their inevitable encounter with modern humans, the Homo sapiens, who would come to change the course of history forever? As we delve deeper into the existence of Neanderthals, it is essential to understand that they were not solitary beings wandering aimlessly through icy and desolate landscapes. They lived in small social groups, united by bonds of blood, collaboration, and mutual protection. In these small communities, each member had a clear role. Some hunted, others gathered fruits and roots, and others cared for the children or the elderly. The collective was more important than the individual. Without cooperation, there was no possibility of survival. These groups moved frequently, adapting to the availability of resources. They did not build permanent villages, but knew how to strategically use natural shelters, caves, rock outcroppings, and wooded areas. They chose places near water sources, with good visibility to detect dangers, and with access to animal migration routes. This mobility allowed them to colonize vast regions of Europe and Western Asia, from the Atlantic coasts to the edges of the present-day Middle East. But life in these environments was brutally demanding. The seasons marked the rhythm of hunger or abundance. In winter, temperatures dropped to unbearable levels, and hunting became dangerous. Mammoths, bison, and giant deer were valuable sources of food, but capturing them required complex group strategies. Evidence has been found of natural traps used by Neanderthals, such as cliffs or ravines where they would drive animals to force them to fall. This tactic reveals impressive tactical intelligence and a sophisticated level of communication. Although there are no written records, scientists believe that Neanderthals developed rudimentary forms of language. Their anatomical capabilities, such as the position of the hyoid bone and the structure of the rib cage, suggest they could produce a wide range of sounds. They possibly had a basic vocabulary to identify dangers, give orders, or name objects. Some researchers argue that they could even express complex emotions or tell simple stories around the fire. That fire, an ancestral symbol of protection and communion, was central to their lives. The fire gave them warmth, allowed them to cook food, kept predators away, and offered a space for socializing. Imagine a glacial night with wolves howling in the distance and snow falling incessantly. In the midst of that darkness, a small group of Neanderthals gathers in a circle, silently watching the flames dance. Perhaps one of them picks up a bone and strikes a stone, sharpening a tool. Another feeds the fire with dry branches. A third cares for a creature wrapped in furs. In that scene, so ancient and so human, lies the whole essence of our heritage. In addition to the use of fire and tools, Neanderthals demonstrated artistic abilities that were long denied by science. In caves like La Pasiega in Spain, drawings, markings, and geometric symbols made more than 60,000 years ago, before the arrival of Homo sapiens on the European continent, have been found. This suggests that Neanderthals already possessed their own form of symbolic and aesthetic expression. What was the meaning of these marks? No one knows for sure. They could have been group signals, spiritual representations, or simple forms of visual entertainment. What is clear is that they reveal a mind capable of abstracting and communicating something beyond the tangible. Another striking example of their humanity is the use of body ornaments. Necklaces made from animal claws, ochre pigments for painting the body, and perforated shells have been found. These practices indicate that Neanderthals had a notion of individual identity and possibly a social structure that valued status or beauty. In such a dangerous world, where daily survival was a challenge, taking the time to decorate the body reveals something profoundly human: the need to express oneself, to differentiate, to belong. However, not everything in their life was evolution and progress. They also faced constant threats: diseases, injuries, predator attacks, and sudden climate changes. Many Neanderthals died young, before the age of 30. Women probably gave birth in extremely precarious conditions, and infant mortality was high. Untreated wounds infected quickly, and the lack of modern medicine made any accident a possible death sentence. Still, some lived beyond 40, a remarkable feat for their time. Despite these difficulties, Neanderthals endured for hundreds of thousands of years. They knew how to adapt to the most extreme changes the Earth could offer. They lived in an era of glaciers that advanced like walls of ice, covering vast expanses of the planet, changing the geography and destroying entire habitats. Every time the climate became unbearable, they migrated, explored new lands, and sought safer shelters. Their history is a chronicle of resilience and evolution. And it was precisely during one of those long periods of change, about 60,000 years ago, that an encounter occurred that would change everything: the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe from the African continent. These new humans brought with them more advanced tools, complex linguistic structures, and a different social organization. For a long time, it was thought that the contact between Neanderthals and sapiens was immediate and violent.
However, modern genetic studies reveal a more nuanced truth. Yes, there were conflicts, no doubt, but there was also coexistence, exchange, and reproduction. Proof of this is the presence of Neanderthal DNA in modern genomes. This genetic interbreeding was not anecdotal. It occurred repeatedly in multiple regions and over thousands of years. The children of these hybrid unions were accepted into the groups, grew up, reproduced, and passed on their heritage to future generations. This genetic integration is one of the most fascinating pieces of the evolutionary puzzle. But the question remains: if they were so adaptable, so resilient, so human, why did they go extinct? The extinction of the Neanderthals is one of the greatest mysteries of prehistory. How did a species that survived glaciations, giant predators, and the most relentless diseases disappear so suddenly? The answers are not simple, but scientists have outlined solid hypotheses that combine climatic, ecological, genetic, and social factors. And they all converge on a disturbing conclusion. The disappearance of the Neanderthals was not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual process of attrition. One of the most accepted theories is that of climate change. Between 45,000 and 40,000 years ago, the planet experienced drastic oscillations in climate. Temperatures fell and rose in increasingly rapid cycles, altering the natural habitat of the Neanderthals. Entire forests disappeared. Large animals migrated or became extinct, and water sources changed location. In this unpredictable environment, the specialization of the Neanderthals, which for centuries was their greatest strength, became an evolutionary trap. Their body, perfectly adapted to extreme cold, began to be less effective in regions where the climate became warmer or more humid. Their diet, based on hunting large animals, no longer found available prey, and their limited mobility compared to Homo sapiens prevented them from quickly seeking new territories. To this was added a decline in the birth rate, aggravated by diseases, famines, and increased competition for resources. Slowly, their populations began to shrink. In parallel, Homo sapiens thrived. Their ability to form extensive social networks, their linguistic skill, their organization into more structured tribes, and their ecological adaptability gave them a decisive advantage. Sapiens not only hunted, they also gathered, fished, domesticated animals, made more efficient clothing, and built more versatile tools. But most importantly, they had a different worldview. While Neanderthals lived in small, isolated groups, sapiens established alliances between clans, shared knowledge, and developed more advanced forms of symbolic culture. They painted caves with detailed representations of animals, invented musical instruments, sculpted abstract figures, and created myths. These forms of complex thought were not just artistic expressions. They were tools for social cohesion, knowledge transmission, and long-term planning. Thus, in many regions, Homo sapiens slowly displaced the Neanderthals, not necessarily through violence, but by simple demographic replacement. As one group grew in number, the other diminished. And although there was interbreeding, as modern genetics shows, this was not enough to stop the collapse of the Neanderthal population. The last Neanderthal strongholds survived in remote areas, such as the south of the Iberian Peninsula. In places like Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, there is evidence of their presence as recently as 40,000 years ago. They were probably the last lights of a species that resisted with dignity until the end. It is possible to imagine a small Neanderthal group living in a cave by the sea, watching the horizon, not knowing they were the last of their lineage, that their days were numbered, not by a war, but by the slow but inevitable march of time. This silent disappearance has been interpreted in many ways. Some see it as an evolutionary tragedy, others as a natural process within the flow of biological history. But what is certain is that the footprint of the Neanderthals was not completely erased. It lives on in our genes, in our past, and perhaps even in certain traits of our personality. Some studies suggest that fragments of Neanderthal DNA are related to functions of the immune system, the way we perceive pain, or certain mental predispositions. In a way, the Neanderthals did not become completely extinct. they transformed into a part of us. Science continues to reveal surprising aspects about these ancient humans. In recent years, the analysis of their genome has allowed us to partially reconstruct their appearance, their physiology, and even their vulnerability to certain diseases. It has also given clues about their migrations and relations with other human species. Each new discovery debunks myths and forces us to reevaluate what it means to be human. At this point, a fundamental question arises. Should we consider Neanderthals as a separate species or as a subspecies of our own? The answer is still debated among experts. Some classify them as Homo neanderthalensis, a parallel branch to Homo sapiens. Others prefer the classification Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, which would imply they were not completely different, but a variant of ourselves. This dilemma is not just a taxonomical issue. It is a reflection of the eternal conflict between difference and belonging. What is clear is that Neanderthals were humans, with their limitations and talents, with their culture, their language, their emotions, their fears. They were not caricatures of brutality as they were portrayed for so long. They were a complex, sensitive, adaptive species. And their story, far from being a footnote in the books of evolution, is an essential chapter in understanding our own identity. So, when we look back, when we observe their fossils, their tools, their paintings, we are not simply studying the other.
We are looking at ourselves in a very ancient mirror. A mirror where the echoes of extinct voices, of steps in the snow, of gazes lit by curiosity, fear, or hope still resonate. But there is still more to discover. What do the most recent archaeological sites tell us about their daily life? What foods did they prefer? What diseases did they suffer from? What do the objects they left behind reveal about their inner world? And perhaps most unsettling, why do some current theories suggest that we could still find living traces of Neanderthals beyond their DNA? The most recent archaeological discoveries have shed new light on the daily aspects of Neanderthal life. It is no longer just about fossilized bones or scattered stone tools in ancient rock shelters. Today, scientists are unearthing fragments of history that reveal how they thought, what they felt, and how they related to each other. These findings transform our view of Neanderthals, showing them not as primitive savages, but as profoundly human beings with routines, emotions, and a symbolic world under construction. One of the elements that has most fascinated researchers is the Neanderthal diet. For a long time, it was believed that they were exclusively carnivores, great hunters who depended on the meat of mammoths, bison, or deer. However, recent studies of microscopic residues found in dental tartar and coprolites, fossilized excrement, have shown that their diet was much more varied. Neanderthals also consumed wild fruits, roots, mushrooms, nuts, legumes, and even seaweed in coastal regions. In some settlements, traces of cooking have been found, suggesting they knew how to apply fire to soften foods or eliminate toxins. But diet was not just a matter of survival, it also had a social function. There are indications that they shared food in community, that they cared for the weaker members, and that they organized themselves around specific tasks. Cooperation was key. At sites like El Cidrón in Spain, skeletons of individuals of different ages have been found buried together, with signs of having lived in a family structure. Some show healed bone fractures, indicating they received care during periods of convalescence. This points to empathetic and solidary behavior, unbecoming of a species portrayed for centuries as brutal and instinctive. Furthermore, Neanderthals had a special relationship with death. In various regions of Europe, burials have been discovered that do not respond to chance or natural causes. Some bodies were placed in specific positions, accompanied by tools, animal bones, or mineral pigments like red ochre. This suggests the existence of funeral rituals, or at least an awareness regarding the end of life. We do not know if they believed in an afterlife, but it seems clear that death was not indifferent to them. That type of symbolic behavior is closely related to spirituality and culture. Another revealing aspect is their ability to build and modify the environment. In 2016, in the Bruniquel cave in France, circular structures made with broken stalagmites were found, dated to more than 170,000 years ago. The constructions were erected by Neanderthals and are located more than 300 meters from the entrance in total darkness. What was their purpose? Were they ritual sites, shelters, or simple storage areas? We do not know for sure, but what is evident is that these humans were capable of planning, organizing materials, and executing complex tasks under extreme conditions. And although they did not possess technology as advanced as that of Homo sapiens, Neanderthals were not clumsy or limited in their ingenuity. They developed highly precise stone knapping techniques, mastered the use of fire, worked animal skins to create clothing, and probably made bags or containers with natural fibers. There is even evidence that they used adhesives made from heated birch bark, a chemical process that implies remarkable empirical knowledge. Objects with regular perforations and possible decorative elements, such as claws of birds of prey, probably used as pendants, have also been found. This type of personal adornment may indicate a concern for appearance, a sense of identity, or belonging to a group. In short, everything suggests that Neanderthals had a richer and more sophisticated inner world than previously thought. However, perhaps the most impactful advance in understanding these humans comes from the field of genetics. By sequencing the Neanderthal genome, scientists have found that between 1 and 4% of the DNA of current Eurasian populations comes directly from them. This means that the crossing between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was not an isolated event, but a significant part of the encounter between both species. This genetic heritage has had diverse effects. For example, some Neanderthal genes are associated with greater immunological resistance to certain viruses, while others may influence the structure of the skin, hair, or susceptibility to autoimmune diseases. In other words, we carry within us not only the memory, but also the biological fragments of a species that we knew how to integrate and absorb. This intertwining forces us to rethink the idea of human as a fixed category. If our own biology is the result of encounters, crossings, and adaptations with other hominids, then our history is not that of a straight line towards perfection, but a mosaic of contributions, accidents, and collaborations. Neanderthals are an essential part of that mosaic. And what's more, their history invites us to look at the present with humility. In a world obsessed with efficiency, competition, and the survival of the fittest, Neanderthals teach us that resisting for hundreds of thousands of years requires not brutality, but community, ingenuity, and the ability to adapt. That even in the darkness of a deep cave, it is possible to build, share, care, and perhaps dream. But this is not the last word. There are still questions to be answered.
What do isotopic analyses reveal about their migrations? What are the implications of their legacy for understanding the current diversity of humanity? Could current technology, such as artificial intelligence or genetic editing, allow for a symbolic or scientific resurrection of the Neanderthal species? One of the most intriguing aspects of the Neanderthal legacy is their relationship with the natural environment and how they adapted to the extreme climatic challenges of the Ice Age. They lived in an unstable period, marked by drastic changes in temperature, prolonged glaciations, variations in sea levels, and abrupt transformations in fauna and flora. Surviving for hundreds of millennia in that context was no small feat. Neanderthals not only withstood these conditions, but also learned to live with them, mastering adaptation techniques that still impress scientists today. To face the extreme cold, Neanderthals developed compact and robust bodies with shorter limbs than Homo sapiens. This anatomical configuration minimized heat loss, an advantage in cold regions like Central and Eastern Europe. In addition, there are strong indications that they made clothing with animal skins, fitted to the body with cords or sinews. Although no direct remains of clothing have been preserved, the wear patterns on bone and stone tools indicate the repeated work of tanning and perforating skins. They also built rudimentary shelters when caves were not available. Some sites showed traces of structures made with mammoth bones and branches, insulated with mud or moss. These temporary settlements reveal an understanding of space and comfort, as well as an ability to plan, anticipate needs, and modify the environment to make it more habitable. As for hunting, Neanderthals were experts. Their prey were often large: bison, woolly rhinoceros, aurochs, wild horses. To capture them, they used fire-hardened wooden spears and worked in groups, applying strategies of ambush or driving them towards cliffs or natural traps. This type of hunting required coordination, nonverbal communication, bravery, and strength. It was not an improvised task, it was an ancestral choreography that could lead to success or disaster. Fossil footprints at some sites show that even children and the elderly participated in group activities, although more indirectly. Neanderthal life was intergenerational. Everyone played a role, from transmitting knowledge to caring for the youngest. They were not societies where the weak or useless were marginalized. They were communities where survival was a shared responsibility. Another fascinating topic is the possibility of language. Although no written inscriptions or clearly defined symbols have been found, there are multiple reasons to believe that Neanderthals had a complex form of communication. Their craniofacial anatomy suggests they had a vocal apparatus capable of producing a wide range of sounds. In addition, the FOXP2 gene, linked in modern humans to the development of articulate language, has been identified in their genome. While we do not know what their language sounded like or what their vocabulary was, it is almost certain that they communicated through a system with rules, probably based on sounds, gestures, and expressions. This ancestral language would not only have served to coordinate the hunt, but also to share stories, teach the young, express emotions, or resolve conflicts. The word, although primitive, was already beginning to shape the world. In parallel, Neanderthals showed an artistic sensitivity that defies stereotypes. In several caves in Spain, such as La Pasiega, Ardales, or Maltravieso, cave paintings more than 64,000 years old have been found, before the same as they arrived in the peninsula. These works, negative hands, abstract symbols, dots, and lines, have been attributed to the Neanderthals. And while their exact meaning is lost in time, there is no doubt that they represent a form of symbolic expression. Those marks on the rock could be territorial markers, messages for other groups, passage rituals, or simple aesthetic expressions. But what really matters is that behind them there is an intention, a mind capable of abstracting and representing.
This completely changes our conception of Neanderthals. They were not just strong and resilient bodies, but also sensitive spirits, capable of imagining and capturing what they saw or felt. In addition, the analysis of microfragments on tools reveals a diversified use of materials such as mineral pigments, natural resins, and plant fibers. All this suggests that Neanderthals were not mere passive survivors of their environment, but active agents who transformed, domesticated, and re-signified the world they inhabited. The relationships between Neanderthal groups have also been studied. Although there were no cities or states, it is likely that they organized themselves into mobile bands of 10 to 30 individuals, which dispersed or united according to the seasons, the abundance of resources, or territorial conflicts. Genetic footprints indicate they were not completely endogamous. There was exchange between groups, which promoted diversity and reduced the risk of hereditary diseases. This exchange could have included not only individuals, but also ideas, techniques, and knowledge. Thus, what a group learned in the south of Europe could, over time, reach the eastern steppes, adapted to new conditions.
Neanderthal culture was not static, but dynamic and fluid, like a river that finds its course among the rocks of time. And yet, despite all their resilience, adaptability, and complexity, the Neanderthals disappeared. What happened? Why did a species so well adapted, so intelligent, so human, cease to exist? The question remains open, but the theories abound. Some point to climate change, others to competition with Homo sapiens, and others to low population density combined with natural catastrophes. It has also been suggested that, in a way, they did not disappear completely. They were assimilated, like drops of ink diluted in a larger genetic ocean. Their essence lives on in us. But before addressing their extinction, there is still much to explore. Their migratory routes, their contacts with other human species, their survival strategies in the last millennia of their existence. The Neanderthal mystery is far from being exhausted. To understand the decline of the Neanderthals, it is necessary to look to the east, to the routes along which modern Homo sapiens expanded. Approximately 70,000 to 80,000 years ago, waves of Homo sapiens began to leave Africa, migrations that would eventually lead them to Europe. This encounter between two human species was not immediate or necessarily violent in its early stages. For thousands of years, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens coexisted in certain regions, such as the Mediterranean Levant, exchanging territories, customs, and in some cases, genes. Traces of Neanderthal DNA in the modern human genome confirm that interbreeding occurred between the two species. On average, between 1% and 3% of the DNA of current non-African humans comes from Neanderthals. This genetic entanglement indicates a deep biological proximity, so close that they not only shared the same planet, but the same bed. These encounters were not merely biological, they probably also involved some degree of communication, coexistence, and collaboration. But that interaction was not symmetrical. Homo sapiens brought with them lighter and more versatile tools, a more complex social organization, and above all, a highly developed symbolic capacity. Technological innovation, the creation of figurative art, long-term planning, and sophistication in language gave Homo sapiens competitive advantages that slowly tipped the balance in their favor. It was not an open war or a sudden genocide. The disappearance of the Neanderthals was a long, gradual, and multifactorial process. In some regions, they resisted until 40,000 years ago. In others, their presence faded earlier. The low population density of Neanderthals played a crucial role. Small, isolated groups with little genetic exchange were more vulnerable to diseases, famines, and natural disasters. In addition,
The competition for limited resources in harsh and variable environments meant that even slight advantages could be decisive. The greater mobility and adaptability of Homo sapiens allowed them to occupy territories more efficiently, exploit new food sources, and establish broader social networks. Faced with this, the Neanderthals found themselves increasingly confined, fragmented, and weakened. However, it is a mistake to imagine their disappearance as a total defeat. Their legacy persists not only in our DNA, but in the very history of the human being. Some researchers suggest that certain behaviors, such as the inclination for tribal cooperation, organization in clans, or even certain immunological predispositions, could be partially influenced by that Neanderthal heritage. And beyond genetics, Neanderthals teach us a profound lesson about the human condition. They were aware of death, as shown by the intentional burials found in caves like Shanidar in Iraq or La Ferracie in France. In some of these tombs, remains with traces of pollen have been found, which suggests they placed flowers next to their dead. Although the exact symbolism is difficult to decipher, this practice points to a respect for those who departed and perhaps a spiritual conception of life. This evidence of funerary rituals challenges an old scientific belief that placed Neanderthals as mere intelligent beasts. Today, archaeology recognizes them as human beings in the fullest sense of the word, capable of loving, suffering, remembering, and perhaps even praying. They were not an inferior subspecies, but a different humanity with their own ways of understanding the world. They also developed a deep knowledge of the natural environment. They knew which plants were edible, which could be used for medicinal purposes, and which route to follow according to the seasons. Marks on fossil bones indicate that they were capable of hunting with surgical precision, selecting the most nutritious and useful parts of each animal. At some sites, complex tools made of stone combined with plant-based adhesives have been found, which implies an advanced mastery of techniques that required multiple steps and patience. It is possible that they also told stories by the fire. We have no direct evidence of oral narratives, but human societies have always used stories as a form of cultural transmission. The Neanderthals, with their emerging linguistic capacity and their social structure, very likely shared experiences, warnings, or legends through stories transmitted from generation to generation. The last Neanderthals survived in peripheral regions of Europe, such as Gibraltar, where some groups subsisted until just over 37,000 years ago. There, in the caves by the sea, they lived their last days. They hunted seabirds, collected mollusks, lit fires, and watched the ocean horizon, without knowing they would be the last of their kind. That final image is profoundly moving, an ancestral community resisting in silence, knowing perhaps that the world they knew was disappearing. Their end was not a dramatic event, but a slow evaporation in time. They disappeared without monuments, without writings, without glorious tombs. But their story was imprinted on the stones, on the bones, on the abandoned tools, and, of course, in our blood.
We are the heirs of their struggle, their wisdom, their pain, and their love. And even today, more than 40,000 years later, we continue to unearth fragments of their existence to reconstruct a story that is also ours. Because understanding the Neanderthals is not just looking at the past, it is understanding where we come from and perhaps where we are going. When archaeologists and geneticists talk about Neanderthals, a question inevitably arises that cuts across centuries of prejudice, science, and philosophy. What truly made us different from them? If we shared practical intelligence, complex emotions, rituals, and even genetic offspring, at what point do we draw the line between them and us? For a long time, science sought to point to language as that great differentiator. It was said that Homo sapiens were the only ones with the capacity to articulate complex and abstract symbols through words, something that would allow us to develop collective narratives, foundational myths, religions, and more elaborate social structures. However, studies of the hyoid bone from Neanderthal fossils, as well as their cranial case and the DNA related to language, specifically the FOXP2 gene, indicate that they probably also had a developed oral communication system. So, if it wasn't language, could it have been a more sophisticated symbolic capacity? Homo sapiens began to paint caves with human and animal figures, create sculptures like the Venus of Hohlefels, and carve musical instruments like bone flutes. These expressions, dated to more than 35,000 years ago, showed a mind with a deep need for transcendence, art, and representation of the invisible world. Although Neanderthals also used mineral pigments, feathers, and pendants, their symbolic expressions were more limited and did not expand with the same intensity as in Homo sapiens. However, even that difference is nuanced by new findings. In the La Pasiega cave in Spain, cave paintings more than 64,000 years old, predating the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe, and attributed to Neanderthals, have been found. These works, although more rudimentary, indicate a mind that also sought to represent and leave a mark. Was the difference not one of capacity, but of degree and social context? Another fascinating hypothesis suggests that Homo sapiens had a broader collaboration network. They not only lived in family groups, but also related to distant tribes, exchanging knowledge, tools, and perhaps even customs. This extended social network allowed for a more robust accumulation of knowledge and faster innovation. In contrast, Neanderthals, with their smaller and more isolated populations, did not manage to sustain the same cultural dynamism. As for resilience to climate change, Homo sapiens showed a greater flexibility. While Neanderthals mainly inhabited the cold zones of Europe, Homo sapiens had already crossed deserts, jungles, and savannas, adapting to a variety of extreme landscapes. That early migratory experience could have developed not only a more resistant biology, but also a more exploratory and audacious mentality. But perhaps the deepest difference lies not in a specific skill, but in the ability to create shared symbolic structures that cohesively large human groups. Primitive religions, rites of passage, origin narratives, and moral norms allowed Homo sapiens to unite beyond blood ties. This social cohesion, enhanced by language and imagination, gave rise to villages, alliances, and eventually, civilizations. The Neanderthals, it seems, did not reach that symbolic critical mass. But that does not mean they were less human. Perhaps they simply followed another evolutionary path, one that ended earlier, but left deep footprints in the history of life. Today, the scientific interest in Neanderthals has grown intensely. We no longer see them as coarse caricatures or primitive savages. We now consider them an essential part of our own history. Their bones, tools, and genes reveal a parallel humanity with its own achievements, limitations, and mysteries. And as we look more closely, we discover that many of our modern perceptions of Neanderthals are colored by our need to differentiate ourselves. Perhaps it is uncomfortable to accept that we are not unique, that there once were other humans walking the earth with similar capacities, comparable emotions, and dreams perhaps not so different. The question then is not only what extinguished them, but what allowed us to survive. Was it a simple matter of genetic luck, or were we able to develop a social and cognitive structure that made us unstoppable? Perhaps both. But even so, We owe the Neanderthals something more than comparisons. We owe them respect and memory. Because in every fossil we find, in every fragment of DNA we carry, in every tool carved tens of thousands of years ago, there is a voice that still resonates from the depths of time. A voice that tells us that we were not the first, nor were we the only ones. That there were others before us, with their own version of fire, of fear, of hope. And there is still much to discover. Every new archaeological finding redefines what we thought we knew. In recent years, Neanderthal remains have been found with evidence of having been cared for during illness, of having survived with severe disabilities thanks to the help of the group. That speaks to us of compassion, of primitive ethics, of deep bonds.
There were communities that did not abandon the weak but protected them. Is that not one of the purest forms of humanity? As we close this part of the story, we approach the conclusion of a millennial history, not with sadness, but with admiration. The rediscovery of the Neanderthals has not only rewritten history books, it has also transformed the way we see ourselves. For centuries, modern humanity has sought to define itself in contrast to what it considered the other, the primitive, the savage. In that attempt, the Neanderthals were turned into a distorted shadow, brutes without souls, without art, without love. But the evidence accumulated in recent decades forces us to tear down that distorted mirror. What we find on the other side is not a monster, but a human being, different, yes, but also familiar. Getting to know the Neanderthals is, deep down, an exercise in humility. It shows us that humanity was not born from a single mold, but from a plurality of attempts, paths, and ways of existing. This recognition is not merely scientific, it is also cultural and philosophical. In literature, film, anthropology, and psychology, the Neanderthals have begun to be rescued as symbols of the lost otherness, of what we were and what we could have been. They no longer represent what we left behind, but an unassumed part of our own identity. In a world that constantly faces the fear of the different, the rejection of the foreign, the example of the Neanderthals resonates strongly, because it reminds us that we coexisted with others for millennia, and that from that coexistence we were born, literally and symbolically. We carry within us the legacy of that mix. To be human is also to be Neanderthal. Moreover, understanding the Neanderthals connects us with the fragility of existence. They were able to withstand glaciations, climatic catastrophes, fearsome predators and long winters, only to disappear silently, not for lack of intelligence or absolute violence, but for a combination of complex circumstances that we are still trying to understand. Their story is a warning and an inspiration. A warning because it teaches us that no species, however powerful, is guaranteed against change. Not even us. We face our own challenges today: environmental collapse, global conflicts, technological advances that transform what is human. Remembering the Neanderthals is remembering that survival requires adaptation, cooperation, and above all, humility. An inspiration because, despite everything, they flourished for hundreds of thousands of years. They learned to make fire, to hunt in groups, to care for their sick, to carve tools, to build shelters, and possibly to bury their dead with flowers. In their daily acts there was beauty, dignity, and resistance. They lived with intensity, although they did not leave cities or empires. And that is another powerful lesson, the value of the simple. In a world obsessed with material progress,
The history of the Neanderthals speaks to us of the power of bonds, of knowledge transmitted by the fire, of community care, of life connected to the rhythms of nature. It forces us to ask what is truly essential. In modern genetic laboratories, scientists continue to decipher fragments of Neanderthal DNA. What was once fossil dust now becomes maps of lineages, proteins, hereditary diseases, and even influences on behavior. Some genetic variants related to immunity or the way we metabolize food come directly from them. But beyond biology, their presence persists as a seed in our collective consciousness. What would Neanderthals do today if they were still among us? Would they form their own communities? Would they be accepted? Would they have political, religious, artistic representation? These questions, although hypothetical, reveal much about our current values. For a long time, we refused to recognize Neanderthals as equals. It was easier to see them as a surpassed step on the ladder of evolution. But evolution is not a ladder. It is a tree with many branches, and some of them are cut, not because of inferiority, but by chance, by the unforeseen turn of a climate or a disease. Today, the most rigorous science agrees on something that the ancients could not imagine. Neanderthals were not an evolutionary failure. They were a full, complex, sensitive humanity, and their story did not really end. It lives in us. Every cell that carries a part of their legacy is proof that they did not become completely extinct. Their blood, their memory, and their presence still beat in millions of human beings. Perhaps the most beautiful thing about their story is that in the silence of their caves and in the darkness of their time, they left an invisible mark that we are only now beginning to understand. They did not write books, but they gave us chapters. They did not raise monuments, but they built foundations. They did not leave kingdoms, but they gave us humanity. Now, as we close this journey, I invite you to reflect on the true measure of what is human. If Neanderthals loved, cared, created, what more is needed to deserve a place in our history? Perhaps the human species did not begin with us, nor does it end with us. We are just another episode, and our duty is to remember those who walked before us under the same stars, with the same dreams. If this story touched your heart, share in the comments what surprised or moved you the most about the Neanderthals. Did it change your view of them? What do you think they could teach us today? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and share this video with those who love history, science, and the exploration of the deep past. Together we can continue to discover the secrets that still sleep beneath the earth and in our blood. Thank you for joining us this far.